Welcome to this introduction to the prophecy of Ezekiel. He is a transmitter of news on God's behalf. Bad news initially, and then good news. The environment where he is operating is a particular feature of his ministry. He is operating in Babylon. The book might be summarized in this fashion. God is appalled by Judah's obstinacy. In consequence, he will extend initial exile to the point to which the city of Jerusalem is completely destroyed. But that's not the final chapter. Yet he will restore her. In addition, God has a message through Ezekiel to foreign nations, for they too will be held accountable for behavior. Let's begin by examining the historical context for Ezekiel's ministry. This is a rather complicated period in the history of Israel. Consequently, we'll be examining it and re-examining it from a variety of angles. So don't be surprised if you find some of the information repeating. Hopefully that will make it a little bit easier to grasp. First of all, Ezekiel's location. As mentioned a moment ago, he is prophesying not from Israel, but in Babylon. We're told that he is located in Nippur, which is a couple of hundred miles upstream the Tigris-Euphrates in the vicinity of the Persian Gulf. More particularly, he's in the community of Tel Aviv. This is not the Tel Aviv of Israel, but rather a community of ancient Nippur. And in chapter 1, we understand that he is alongside a particular waterway known as the Kibar Canal. Here you see the Persian Gulf in the lower right, Nippur and Babylon following upstream, and on the eastern side of Nippur, we understand, was located the Kibar Canal. Let's use the Google Earth technology for a few moments to get an idea of Ezekiel's transit from the Judean area with the capital in Jerusalem. 597 is the year. Jehoiakim had a brief reign until Nebuchadnezzar came rolling in and determined it was time to re-exert power. He sets Zedekiah up on the throne and takes population captive, deporting them, perhaps along this route, into Babylon. Ezekiel is among this group. We're told in chapter 1 of Ezekiel that he experiences a vision by the Kibar Canal alongside some other exiles and is in the Babylonian territory. When we explore to find out exactly where this Kibar Canal may have been located, we learn from some ancient records that there was a similar body of water that was east of the ancient city of Nippur. While Nippur is not mentioned in Ezekiel, we speculate that this might have been the territory where Ezekiel found himself in the chapter 1 vision. The city of Nippur dates to 5000 BC, so an extremely venerable ancient city. It was frankly the religious center of the Mesopotamian Valley for century after century, so predating Babylon, predating Nineveh, sites of this sort, a very, very ancient and eminent city. It was first excavated in the 1880s by the University of Pennsylvania, and subsequent to that by the Chicago University. And we find that they have provided for us a site plan that gives us an idea of the structures they've found. Gradually overlay it on the Google image. And what's of particular interest to us today is the fact that they have included some bodies of water, particularly some ancient canals. You see them depicted here. The Kibar Canal may have been one of these on the east side of the city. So perhaps this is where Ezekiel was in the vision of chapter 1. Let's explore a bit further this question. How did Ezekiel wind up in Babylonia? Nabopolassar has regained control of Babylon, the capital of their area, and then finished off the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, the first taking place around 626, 625, the second taking place in 612. He's done that with the help of the Medes, led by Cyaxares II. In 605, he's followed by his son, Nebuchadnezzar, ruling Babylon. Pharaoh Necho II in Egypt is uncomfortable with the rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, so he launches some countermeasures to try and prop up the ailing Assyrian Empire. In 605, there's a conflict with the Babylonians at the gateway city of Carchemish, and the Egyptians lose at that point, and that gives an occasion for the Babylonians to roll south from Carchemish along through Syria and the Palestinian coastline coming into Israel, and there they reestablish dominance in Israel. This is happening 605. Jehoiakim, who was set up by the Egyptians in 609, now has to bow to the Babylonians in 605. It's at that time that the Babylonians deport some of the population of Israel, and Daniel is in the group that is deported. Later on, Jehoiakim has a brief reign beginning in 598. At the close of his reign, the Babylonians roll in again, reestablish dominance, and set up Zedekiah as king of Israel. He will be the last king of the southern kingdom. Towards the close of his reign, Babylon responds to a maneuver of rebellion by the Israelites and sets siege to Jerusalem. At this time, Hophra is the pharaoh in Egypt. Israel reaches out to the Egyptians for military assistance, which is effective for a period of time, but then the siege resumes and the Babylonians are victorious, conquering Jerusalem after an 18-month siege, a year-and-a-half-long siege, in 586. Jeremiah is serving as prophet during the bulk of this era. And now we want to call our attention to King Jehoiakim, a brief reign ending in 597. There was a deportation when the Babylonians rolled in, reestablished their dominance. They deported Jehoiakim, setting Zedekiah in his place, and they also deported Ezekiel at that time. Ezekiel's ministry then spans roughly 593 through the fall of Jerusalem in 586, extending to 571. We want to link Ezekiel with Jehoiakim for this reason. Nearly all the dates that Ezekiel provides with a variety of his oracles, dramas, and visions, these are dated from the onset of his deportation with Jehoiakim, 597. So if it says the 5th year, he's talking about 5 years after he, with Jehoiakim and others, arrived in Babylon in 597. If it's the 12th year, it'll be 597 minus 12. So we want to keep Jehoiakim and Ezekiel linked together in order to appreciate what the dates are to which Ezekiel refers within his prophecies. Now let's review some of the same information set up in chart form. Once again, referring to the third column from the left, the one headed in yellow, Israelite prophets. And now our attention is drawn to Ezekiel, spanning 593 to 571. Nebuchadnezzar is the Babylonian leader to be dealt with during this time. It will be under Nebuchadnezzar that Ezekiel will suffer deportation during the reign of Jehoiakim. At the close of the reign of Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim is the southern Israel king who was deported, and Ezekiel with him taken to Babylon. A few years later, under the rule of Zedekiah, Jerusalem falls, 586, and once again, it's due to the Babylonian forces led by Nebuchadnezzar. A chart outlining the final kings of southern Israel will help us get the bigger picture. We'll start with the reign of Josiah from 640 to 609, when unfortunately he attempted to intercept the Egyptian troops that were in transit to Carchemish, was killed by Pharaoh Necho's troops in the process, died at Megiddo. His son Jehoahaz comes rapidly to the throne, but only for a brief period, because the Pharaoh decides that he would rather have an Israelite king who is authorized by him. So he removes Jehoahaz and sets up a brother of Jehoahaz, Eliakim, better known as Jehoiakim. He will reign till 598, initially under authorization of Pharaoh Necho. Later he must bow to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. During his rule, Daniel will be deported to Babylon in 605. Following Jehoiakim, his son Jehoiakim briefly rules. He is 18 years old. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon shows up during this time and reasserts his authority over Israel, resulting in the deportation of King Jehoiakim, his mother, along with about 10,000 others, including Ezekiel. So this answers the question, how did Ezekiel wind up in Babylon? He was not sent there from Israel independently on a mission from God. Rather, he was taken, not planning to go there, just finding himself among those forcibly removed in the 597 deportation. Evidently, after he got there, came the call, and we'll come to that in just a bit. Following the removal of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar sets up the next Israelite king. He will be one more of Josiah's sons by the name of Zedekiah. So we see kings number 2, Jehoahaz, 3, Jehoiakim, and 5, Zedekiah, are all brothers in succession coming to the throne. He will last until 586, the victim of destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. He attempts to escape the city, is caught, and brought as a captive to Babylon. So once again, in 605, Daniel is deported to Babylonia under Nebuchadnezzar during Jehoiakim's reign, and our target prophet this round, Ezekiel, in 597, along with his king, Jehoiakim. 586, Jerusalem will fall. Let's look at the fall of Jerusalem a little more through the eyes of Ezekiel. It's of interest to us that in Ezekiel 24, we find God giving an announcement through Ezekiel, indicating that on this day, the 18-month siege of Jerusalem commences. In chapter 33, verse 21, we have not so much an oracle by Ezekiel, but rather he receives a visitor, an individual who has escaped from the environs of Israel, escaped with a very sad message that Jerusalem has in fact fallen. The siege is concluded, the city has fallen. It's interesting to observe that Jeremiah and Ezekiel's lifespans overlapped. From what we know of Jeremiah's ministry relative to Ezekiel's time frame, he preceded him. Ezekiel overlapped a little bit farther later, following the fall of Jerusalem. Jeremiah is serving God on location in Israel until he's taken to Egypt following the fall of Jerusalem. At the same time, God has assigned Ezekiel to serve the Israelites who have been removed, ministering to them in their own context in Babylonia. It's worth commenting on how the dates operate as they are mentioned within Ezekiel. Quite a number of the oracles begin by indicating what is a particular year, month, and date in the life of Ezekiel. Most of these will reference the beginning of the exile that brought Ezekiel to Babylonia. and that will be indicated as Jehoiakim, a year relative to Jehoiakim, since he was the king when Ezekiel was brought to exile. Jehoiakim's exile then began in 597. Consequently, we'll want to subtract from 597 any of the years that are given as a date stamp. The exception to that appears right at the outset in chapter 1. The 30th year, in this case, is not the 30th year of exile, but rather the 30th year of Ezekiel's own life. That's his age. Consequently, it's identified as the Jehoiakim exile year 5 or the year 592, a few years prior to the siege and fall of Jerusalem in 586. Let's turn our attention to Ezekiel as an individual. What is going on in him and his relationship with God as he fills the role of prophet? First, regarding his call. We do not have a record quite as explicit, say, as Jeremiah's call, or as explicit as Isaiah 6 in the encounter that prophet had with God. But we do have the first vision, and so we infer that this may have been associated at the onset of this vision would have been the first time that Ezekiel felt that he was in a particular way summoned by God as a messenger on his behalf. Also, it's interesting to notice his relationship with God when it comes to a particular dispute. In this case, God is asking him to perform a particular drama message. And this involves cooking some food like an exile would do, using excrement. Now, Ezekiel is okay if this is animal excrement, but human excrement, that would defile him. And so he protests, and he says, can't we modify this particular element of the drama? God relents and says, all right, we won't make it quite as realistic as the level of suffering which the exiles, the people actually in siege, what they will experience. So we see in Ezekiel's relationship with God a little bit of give and take. Not as much, not as expansive as we saw in the so-called confessions of Jeremiah. How about Ezekiel's relationship with others around him in Babylonia? We know, for one thing, in his own background, he came from a priestly family. On some occasions, we find that the elders, who were also in exile, seek him out. So there's a degree of respect which he enjoys. At the same time, some of the words that God gives directly to Ezekiel indicate that he will encounter opposition. From chapter 3, we read this. And you, son of man, be not afraid of them. Look, I have made your face hard against their faces, your forehead hard against their forehead. Like adamant, harder than flint, have I made your forehead. Fear them not, nor be dismayed at their looks. Finally, how about Ezekiel's involvement with the message that he is tasked to convey? We have one indication concerning the empathy that he feels, and this takes place in chapter 11, verse 13. Associated with one of his oracles against people in Jerusalem, an individual by the name of Pelatiah dies. We find this right during the vision. When this occurs, even though Pelatiah is part of the opposition, he is one that Ezekiel must speak against. Despite this fact, Ezekiel, we're told, fell down and cries out, "Ah, sovereign Lord, will you completely destroy the remnant of Israel?" So even though he must oppose certain members of his nation, he feels deeply when they experience suffering.